This book was written more than 100 years ago, yet after reading it, it becomes almost impossible to look at politicians, billionaires, or kind of popular influencers this the same way again. Because Joseph Conrad, long before the internet existed, revealed something deeply uncomfortable. Most people don't become tyrants not because they are inherently good, but because they simply never get the chance to become tyrants. We like to believe that power corrupts people, but what if power doesn't corrupt anyone at all? What if it simply reveals who a person really is? And it is exactly this idea that lies at the uh, heart of darkness. A young sailor travels to Africa and hears stories about a man named Kurtz, a genius, a great humanitarian, an enlightener, a man of the future so extraordinary that he is considered one of the finest representatives of European civilization. But when the narrator finally finds him, the truth turns out to be horrifying. This great civilizer is living deep in the jungle like a pagan god, worshipped by local tribes, with human heads mounted on stakes around his house. At the most terrifying part is that Kurtz, until the very end of his life, still believes he is right, good, a great man. So today we are not just talking about a journey into Africa. We are talking about a book that asks one of the most disturbing questions in literary history. If you give a person absolute power and absolute certainty in their own moral rightness, how long will it take before they turn into a monster? And will they even turn into one? Or was the monster there from the very beginning? More than a century ago, Conrad wrote a book that is often discussed today as a novel about colonialism, racism, and exploitation of Africa. All of that is indeed present in the text, but if you read it closely, it becomes clear that Africa is not only the backdrop. The real heart of darkness is inside of the human being. Subscribe to the channel, like us, comment, and share this video with your friends. You are watching the Rubber Books channel. Let's begin! Before we move into the actual plot, it is worth saying a few words about where the story actually came from. And this is where things become truly interesting. Unlike many writers who invented exotic adventures from the comfort of their desks, Joseph Conrad actually went through the very same kind of hell he later described in The Heart of Darkness. In 1890, he traveled to the Belgian Congo and spent several months working as a captain of a river steamboat on the Congo River. In other words, everything Marlow, main character, experiences in the book, author had either seen himself or was directly inspired by real events. Of course, this is not a documentary or an autobiography, but many scenes, details, and even the structure of the journey are drawn directly from the author's real-life experience. It is especially important to understand one thing. When Conrad went to Africa, like many Europeans of his time, he believed in the comforting story of Europe's civilizing mission. He was told about progress, trade, enlightenment, and bringing development to so-called backward peoples. But reality turned out to be very different. Instead of a noble mission, he witnessed a system built on greed, violence, and human suffering. Later, he would write one of the most brutal lines in the book. They grabbed what they could and they did it purely for profit. Behind the beautiful language of progress There was nothing but a hunt for money. And that raises a very uncomfortable question. If you look at human history, the worst crimes are very rarely committed under banners that say, "We are evil and want to do harm." On the contrary, they usually committed under banners of good progress, justice, freedom, civilization. And this is what shocked Conrad the most. He saw people who considered themselves the peak of culture and morality doing things they would have called barbaric if someone else had done them. The book was published in 1902 and initially didn't make a strong impression on the general public that time. Many readers simply didn't understand what Conrad was trying to say. Some saw it as an exotic adventure story, others saw it a critic of colonialism, but over time it became clear that Conrad had written something far more disturbing. Heart of Darkness turned out to be not a book about Africa, but a book about human nature itself. It is no coincidence that decades later it would inspire Apocalypse Now film, where the story of Kurtz is moved to the Vietnam War. Because Kurtz's story is universal. Eras change, countries change, settings change, but a human being, when given absolute power and convinced of his own moral superiority, remains the same. And the most unsettling part is that Conrad is not describing a born monster. Kurtz does not enter the story as a villain. On the contrary, everyone describes him as an intelligent, talented, and even idealistic. That is exactly why his fall is so terrifying. We are not dealing with someone who was always a monster. We are dealing with someone who was considered the best of the best. And that leads to the central question of the book. If Kurtz could break, then how stable is civilization we are so proud of in general? With that thought, author begins his descent into the very heart of darkness. Now let's meet the man who will tell us the story, a sailor named Marlow. Marlow, main character. Marlow is the main character. The story does not begin in Africa and not even on a ship sailing up the Congo. Author starts in a much more subtle way. A group of sailors sits on the deck of yacht anchored on Thames, waiting for the tide. Evening is falling, twilight gathers over London, everything is calm, orderly, civilized, everything the British Empire prides itself on. And in this moment, one of the sailors, Marlow, suddenly voices a strange thought. He looks at the Thames and reminds his companions that Britain itself was once a wild fringe of the world, just like Europeans now imagine Africa to be. Once the Romans arrived here and looked at the locals as barbarians. From the very first pages, Conrad breaks the usual picture of the world, suggesting that the line between civilization and savagery is much thinner than it seems. Then Marlow begins telling his story. As a child, he was fascinated by maps, especially the maps of Africa. Today, it is hard to understand that fascination. We live in the age of satellites and Google Maps, but in the 19th century, maps still contained vast white spaces and known territories where the ordinary European had never been. For a boy like Marlow, there were gateways to adventure, one enormous river winding across the entire continent like a snake, particularly captivated him. Later, he admits he dreamed of going there one day, and now the dream begins to come true. As an adult, through family connections, he obtains a position as a captain of a river steamboat in Africa. And here appears one of the ironic layers of the book. Marlow goes to Africa with almost the same illusions people today have when they enter big corporations. He believes it's an interesting job, opportunity, adventure, and a large world opening before him. No, I don't like work. I prefer idleness and dreaming about how many wonderful things one could do. I don't like work. Nobody does. But I like what it gives us. The chance to find ourselves, our true self hidden from everyone else. To find it for ourselves, not for others. People see only the outer shell and can never tell what is hidden behind it. He does not yet understand that he is hidden toward a giant machine that consumes human beings in the name of profit. Before leaving, he visits the company office, and even there the atmosphere already feels unsettling. Two old women sit in the waiting room knitting black wool. Many literary scholars compare them to be Moirai of Greek mythology, the goddess of fate who spin the thread of human life. The symbolism is clear. Marlow is not walking toward a career, but into a kind of underworld. And things only grow darker from there. When his ship reaches the African coast, Marlow expects to see the center of civilization. After all, Europeans constantly spoke about bringing progress to backward people. But instead of progress, he finds chaos. Rocks are being blasted without any visible purpose. Rusting machines lie scattered in the open air. Work is being carried out so senselessly that it seems no one even understands what the goal is. And the more carefully Marlow observes, the stronger the feeling of a massive absurdity becomes. Then comes a scene that destroys his remaining illusions completely. Slightly away from the station, he discovers a group of Africans, former company workers. People so weakened by disease, hunger, and forced labor that they can no longer walk at all. They have simply been dragged under the trees to die, without help, without medicine, without hope. Marlow sees living skeletons lying in the shade, slowly fading away. And here author delivers the first serious blow to the idea of civilizing mission. The picture becomes grotesque. People who came to save Africa are living behind mountains of corpses. The conquest of the earth, which mostly means taking it away from people with different skin tones or slightly flatter noses, is not a very pretty thing when you look into it too much. At this moment, the reader begins to realize that the real jungle is not outside the station. The real jungle is inside the people who came here for ivory and profit. Marlow is still trying to hold on to his sense of order and logic, but very soon he will meet the man who pushes this logic to its absolute limit. A man named Kurtz, about whom nobody can speak calmly. Some call him a genius, others call him the company's best agent, and some pronounce his name as if they are speaking of a prophet or even God. And the more Marlow hears this name, the more he begins to understand that the center of this story is not Africa. The center of the story is Kurtz. a man no one has yet seen but who already inspires more fear than the jungle itself. The company station in Africa. For the next few days, Marlow stays at the company station and gradually realizes that he has arrived in a very strange place. Formally, this is where adult professionals work, representing one of the most powerful organizations in the region. But the more he observes what is going on, the more it feels like everyone is involved in some kind of meaningless theatrical performance. Nobody is really doing anything. Nobody is truly responsible for anything. Everyone is constantly scheming, spreading rumors, and fighting for promotions. If Marlow once imagined Africa as a place of wilderness, he now begins to suspect that true wilderness looks like bureaucracy. It is here that he first meets the manager of the central station. At first glance, he seems completely ordinary, not particularly intelligent, not particularly talented, not particularly educated. Marlow cannot even understand why this man holds such a high position. But then he notices something strange. The manager somehow survives everyone else. People fall ill, die, go insane, but he remains in place year after year. Like some kind of parasite feeding off the system and surviving through its weaknesses. And the more Marlow watches him, the clearer one unpleasant truth becomes. The manager does not hate Kurtz because Kurtz is dangerous. He hates him because Kurtz is talented. Because Kurtz produces more ivory, because Kurtz attracts the attention of the superiors, because next to such a man his own mediocrity becomes painfully obvious. Here Conrad very subtly reveals one of the timeless human conflicts. Sometimes mediocrity fears talent more than it fears wrongdoing. Meanwhile, Marlow finally reaches the steamboat he is suspected to command, and there he is met with a new surprise. The vessel is wrecked, practically destroyed. It turns out that shortly before his arrival, there had been an accident, and now the ship requires major repairs. On paper, everyone is eager to help. In reality, no one is in a hurry to provide tools, parts, or materials. It feels as if someone is deliberately keeping Marlow in a place. As a result, the repairs stretch out for months. And here something important happens. While Marlow is stuck repairing the steamboat, the name Kurtz begins to appear more and more often. Accounts talk about Kurtz, agents talk about him, company officials argue about Kurtz. It feels as if he is present in every room even though he is hundreds of miles away. And the most interesting part is that nobody can clearly explain who he actually is. Some call him a great humanitarian. Others call him an outstanding trading agent. Others say he is destined for a brilliant political career. But the more people describe Kurtz, the less Marlow understands where the man ends and the legend begins. At some point, it becomes clear that Kurtz is not just an employee of the company, he has become a symbol. Everyone sees something different in him. For the administration, he is a source of profit. For his subordinates, a hero. For his rivals, a threat. For idealists, a model of the civilized man. But this is exactly how cults of personality are born. People begin to worship not the real person, but their own fantasies about him. Finally, the repairs are completed, the steamboat is ready to go. Ahead lies The journey up the river towards Kurtz inner station, and here Conrad begins transforming an adventure story into a nightmare. Because traveling through the Congo turns out to be nothing like moving from point A to point B. The deeper the vessel goes into the continent, the stronger the feeling that it is actually moving backward in time. Back towards something ancient, primitive, something that civilization carefully hides under a thin layer of laws, suits, and good manners. Marlow increasingly notices that the surrounding world begins to affect people in disturbing ways. The jungle seems to be watching them, the river feels alive, the silence becomes heavy and oppressive. And above all, the usual sense of control begins to disappear. Europeans are used to thinking of themselves as masters of the world, but here, in endless green and mist, a person suddenly realizes how small and helpless he truly is. And at this point, the journey takes on a different meaning. Marlow thinks he is traveling toward Kurtz, but in reality, Conrad gradually leads us to the idea that every mile upriver brings him not only closer to a mysterious company agent, but also to something far more dangerous: the secret of human nature itself. A question most people prefer not to ask themselves: what would remain of me if all the rules I live by were removed? And very soon this question will stop being philosophical, because ahead lies their first attack and their first encounter with death. They grabbed everything they could grab, and they did it purely for profit. It was robbery, violence, and a large-scale plunder, and people went into it blindly, as befits those who wish to measure themselves against darkness. The conquest of the earth mostly it comes down to taking land from people who have a different skin color or flatter noses than others. It's not a very noble thing when you look at it closely. It is redeemed only by an idea upon which it rests. Not sentimental pretense, but an idea, and a disinterested belief in that idea, something before which one can bow and make sacrifices. The further the steamboat travels up the river, the more the feeling of familiarity disappears. The jungle closes in around the vessel like a dense green wall. Sometimes it feels as if countless eyes are hiding behind the trees. Sometimes figures of natives appear on the shore and vanish just as quickly. Conrad deliberately creates a sense of constant unease. The enemy ceases to be exist, but it cannot be seen. The danger is always present, but no one knows where it will come from. One evening, the steamboat stops a few miles from Kurtz station. The destination is close, and after a month of waiting and repairs, it feels as if the hardest part is already behind them. But this is exactly where one of the most intense scenes of the entire book begins. Because in the morning, a thick fog covers the river, so thick that even the nearest bank cannot be seen. The steamboat seems suspended in a wild void. The crew is strange from the jungle, but cannot tell who is making them or how far away they are. Tension rises with every minute. Everyone feels that something is about to happen, and it does. Suddenly, a hail of arrows downs to the ship from the fog, without warning, without negotiation. Fuck. without even seeing the enemy. Arrows strike the wooden sides, men rush for covers, panic erupts. But what is most shocking is how helpless the so-called great European civilization suddenly looks. The people who believed they were masters of the continent are now terrified passengers firing blindly into a white wall of mist. During the attack, Marlow's helmsman is killed, and here author does something unusual again. Uh, Instead of heroic death scene, we get something dirty, absurd, and meaningless. The man simply collapses next to Marlow, bleeding out. No glory, no romance, only death. Marlow later admits that he was more affected than he expected. The helmsman was not his friend, they barely knew each other, but during the journey this man had become part of his small world of the steamboat. And his death reminds Marlow how fragile the boundary between life and death really is. But the most interesting part comes afterward. The attack ends, the steamboat continues, and suddenly Marlow has a disturbing thought. What if the attackers were not trying to destroy the ship at all? What if they were trying not to kill Kurtz, but to prevent him from being taken away? This idea seems insane. Why would savages protect European trade? Why risk their lives for him? But soon Marlow receives an answer. When his steamboat finally reaches Kurtz station, expectations collapse once again. Instead of a major trading post or a fortified company base, he finds something that looks more like the lair of a religious cult. The first person he meets is a young Russian traveler is absurd colorful with in absurd colorful clothing. His appearance is so strange that he looks like he stepped out of an adventure novel. But even stranger is his attitude toward Kurtz. The Russian is completely in awe of him. He speaks about Kurtz the way fans talk about rock stars, political idols, or internal influencers. Kurtz is brilliant. Kurtz is great. Kurtz understands the world better than anyone else. Kurtz can convince anyone of anything. What's going on? Talking to him, he claimed that Kurtz could not really write, but oh, the way this man spoke, he could electrify a crowd. He had faith. Do you understand? Faith. He could convince himself of anything. He could convince he would have made an outstanding leader of some radical party. What party? I asked. Any party. And here Marlow hears one of the most important descriptions of Kurtz. The way this man spoke, he could electrify a crowd. In effect, Conrad shows us a man who possesses the most dangerous kind of power, power over human minds. Kurtz does not simply give orders, he makes people believe in him voluntarily. But then Marlow notices details that make his blood run cold. Around the house stand stakes. At first they look like a fence. Then it becomes clear there are human heads on top of them. Severed, dried in the sun, displayed openly. Here a myth of the great civilization finally collapses. There is no enlightened leader here, no humanitarian, no hero of progress. There is only a man who has become a local god and rules through fear. But the most terrifying part is not even the heads. It is that Kurtz does not hide from what he has done. He does not see it as a mistake. He feels no remorse. Instead, it seems to his completely natural. And when Marlow finally sees Kurtz himself, he's confronted with another shock. After all, the stories and legends he finds not a powerful conqueror, but a sick, exhausted, dying man. His body is destroyed by disease. His voice still carries that strange force that makes people follow him. And at that moment, Marlow understands something truly horrifying. Kurtz was not destroyed by the jungle, not by illness, not by Africa. Kurtz was destroyed by Kurtz himself. And now we arrive at the central mystery of the entire book. How did an idealist, once seen at the future of civilization, become a man surrounded by human heads and worshipped as a god by an entire tribe? This is the question Conrad begins to unravel in the next scenes, when Kurtz finally speaks for himself. Kurtz. Kurtz appears in the book almost at the very end, but it is around him that the entire story has been revolving all along. And when Marlow finally begins speaking with him, something unexpected happens. Instead of a mad dictator, he meets a man who fully understands what's going on. Yeah, Kurtz does not look insane in the usual sense of the word. He's capable of reasoning, he's capable of persuading, he's capable of speaking in a way that makes people continue listen in a way that, listen to him even when they see the consequences of his power with their own eyes. And that's exactly what makes him truly dangerous. In literature, villains are often portrayed as evil because they are stupid, cruel, or mentally unstable. Kurtz is different. He's intelligent, possibly the most intelligent man in the entire book. And Conrad seems to be asking the reader an uncomfortable question. What if intelligence by itself does not make a person better? What if education, talent, and eloquence only help someone justify their own desires more effectively? It gradually becomes clear that Kurtz was once an idealist. More than that, he sincerely believed in the ideas of progress and civilization. For an international organization, he even wrote a report of how Europeans should bring the light of culture to backward people. The document was so beautiful and inspiring that it was considered the model of humanitarian thought. But there is one small detail. At the very end of the report, Kurtz later added a short handwritten note. Exterminate all the brutes. And here Conrad reveals one of the most terrifying transformations in literature, between elevated speeches about humanism and a call for the extermination of human beings. Not much time passed. More importantly, these two ideas somehow coexisted in the same mind. It sounds insane, but if we think about it, history is full of similar contradictions. People are capable of speaking about love for humanity while hating specific human beings, speaking about freedom while building dictatorships, speaking about good while committing monstrous acts. That is why Kurtz feels so disturbingly modern. Soon it becomes clear that the local tribes do not simply respect Kurtz, they worship him. He has become something between a chief, prophet, and a god. His word is stronger than any law. His wishes becomes commands. His worms becomes rules of the life. In effect, Kurtz has obtained what many people secretly desire but almost never admit: absolute power. No one argues, no one judges, no one says no. This is where Conrad leads us to the central question of the entire book. What happens to a human being when all limits disappear? What happens when there is no need to care about reputation, law, public opinion, or morality? The answer is right in front of us. Human heads on stakes, destroyed lives, a cult of personality, fear. But the most disturbing part is that Kurtz himself never sees himself as a villain. He constantly talks about his plans, his achievements, and what he could still accomplish. Even as the illness is literally killing him, he's not tormented by guilt over his victims. What torments him is the thought that they did not manage to do more. That's, that is why one particular scene becomes so important: the night when Kurt suddenly disappears from the steamboat. Despite his fallen health, he literally crawls back into the jungle, back to his tribe, back to his power. Marlow goes after him and finds him in the darkness. It is one of the most symbolic moments in the book. Here is a man who is already physically near death, yet still incapable of letting go of what is destroying him. In a sense, the scene resembles addiction. Kurtz understands that he is dying, understands that everything is falling apart, but he can no longer abandon power. For him, returning to civilized life is more frightening than death itself. Eventually, Kurtz is brought back to the steamboat and the journey home begins. But now the river seems to flow in the opposite direction. If before Marlow was sailing toward a mystery, now he is carrying that mystery with him. And the weaker Kurtz becomes physically, the more his figure turns into a symbol. Because before his death, Kurtz is finally left alone with himself. Without followers, without power, without control, without legend. It is then that the scene takes place for which Conrad wrote the entire book, a scene still discussed by literary scholars, philosophers, and readers around the world. A scene in which Kurtz finally passes judgment on his own life. And that judgment consists of only two words: exterminate all the brutes. Final. And here we come to the ending, to those very two words for which Conrad carried the reader through all of Africa, through all of the jungles, through all the conversation about civilization, progress, and human nature. Kurtz is dying. His body is finally giving out. There is almost no strength left. And at some point, Marlow noticed that something strange is happening to him in his final moments. It is as if all at once he begins to see what he had never seen before. As if his entire life is being replayed in a matter of seconds. That is when he says, the horror, just two words, but what exactly did he see? This is where interpretations begin, and they have been going on for more than a century. The most common reading is that Kurtz saw his own soul. He saw himself without justifications, without beautiful speeches, without the mask of a great humanitarian and enlightener. All his life he had convinced others that he was acting for a high purpose, for progress, for civilization, for greater future. But in his final seconds all illusions disappear. Only truth remains, and the truth is unbearable. He sees a man who, in the pursuit of power, became a tyrant. A man who began to worship himself, a man who placed his own ego above the lives of others, and worst of all, a man who genuinely believed he was right. In essence, Conrad presents a moment of absolute self-knowledge. That very moment, he hints at it one of the most powerful lines of the book. The greatest thing one can gain from its self-knowledge, which comes too late and brings only regret. Kurtz finally achieves that self-knowledge, but it arrives seconds before death, and nothing can be changed anymore. Marlow is deeply shaken by Kurtz's death. Also, on the surface, it seems strange. They were not even close friends. They spent very little time together, but it was never about friendship. What Marlow saw in Kurtz was something far more disturbing. It's a warning. Throughout the book, he watches how everyone around him convinces themselves of their own virtue. The station manager considers himself a civilized man. The company agents consider themselves sane. The officials in Europe consider themselves as civilized. But only Kurtz goes all the way to the end of the road. He is the only one who looks into the abyss completely. That is why his final words have such an impact on Marlow, because everyone else continues living in illusion, while Kurtz, even if only for a moment, sees the truth. After returning to Europe, there is what I believe the most brilliant and most underrated scene in the entire novel. The story is over, the monster is dead, the journey is finished. The book could end here, but Conrad delivers one final blow. Marlow returns to London and suddenly sees the world around him in a completely different way. People continue going to work, talking about careers, money, politics, and future, but to him it all begins to feel like a performance, as if most people are living inside a shared beautiful illusion. This impression becomes even stronger when he meets Kurtz's fiancée. She still loves him, she still mourns him, she still believes in the great man she once knew. For her, Kurtz remains a noble idealist, almost a hero. And then she asked the question, what were his last words? And Marlow knows the answer. He knows it perfectly well. He heard it with his own ears. The horror, but instead of the truth, he says his last words was your name. And here something happens that many readers miss at a first glance. Throughout the book, Marlow despised lies. He hates it. Openly says, you know, I hate lies. I can't bear them. Not because I'm more honest than others people, but because they frighten me. There is always a hint of death in lies, a smell of decay. Exactly what I hate in the world and wish to forget. Lies makes me miserable. They make me feel risk as if I had eaten something rotten. And yet in the end he lies. Why? Well, because during his journey he learned something he didn't understand before. Truth does not always liberate. Sometimes truth destroys. Kurtz's fiancée does not love the real man, she loves a legend, myth. A beautiful story, and Marlow understands that if he tells her the truth, she will not become wiser or free or happier. She will simply destroy her world. So for the first time in the entire book, he chooses lies. And here Conrad leaves out with the final question. Was Marlow right? Must truth always be spoken or not? Or there are illusions without which a human being simply cannot survive? This is why Heart of Darkness remains such an unsettling book even today. Because in the end, Conrad does not give a simple, comfortable answer. He does not say that evil exists only in colonials, colonizers. He does not say that the problem is only in Africa. He does not say that the Kurtz was a unique monster, right? Instead, he leaves us with a thought that is deeply uncomfortable. The wilderness did not create Kurtz. It only revealed what he already was. And if that is true, then the darkest place on earth is not in the Congo. It is inside the human being, which means the question Conrad leaves up with remains open even today. If all limits, laws, and consequences were removed, what exactly would you see in the middle? Hidden meanings and philosophy. On the surface, Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness looks like a story about a river journey up the Congo. But on deeper level, it is a text about how quickly civilization collapses the moment a person is removed from the familiar framework of social rules. The river here is not geography, it is a symbol of movement into the human psyche itself. The further Marlow travels into Africa, the deeper he is actually descending into the human species from within. One of the central philosophical ideas of the novel is the fragility of so-called civilization. Conrad shows the 19th century European culture is not grounded in inner morality, but in a thin layer of rules, habits, and social agreements. Remove those, and a person doesn't return to nature. Instead, a darker, more primitive layer is revealed: fear, greed, violence, and the desire for power. In this sense, Africa in the novel is not just a continent, but a projection of the internal, unexplored part of the human being, which European civilization prefers not to acknowledge. The figure of Kurtz becomes the philosophical center of the entire story. He is not simply a villain or a madman, but a man who has taken the idea of colonial power to its logical extreme. If colonialism is justified as a civilizing mission, Kurtz removes that mask completely. He no longer pretends to bright lights. He openly embraces power and the right to absolute domination. And at that moment, according to Conrad, a human being stops being a carrier of culture and becomes something primitive, almost mythological. The famous phrase about the horror, it's not just a death cry, but the result of final philosophical revelation. In this last moment, Kurtz does not see the external horror of Africa as European imagined it. He sees the internal emptiness of a human being stripped of moral restraint. It is not fear of the jungle, it is a gaze into the very structure of human nature, where goodness is not automatic, but something that must be constantly maintained and preserved. Joseph Conrad builds the entire novel on duality, light and darkness, civilization and savagery, order and chaos. But one of its key ideas is that these opposites are not separated by geography or race. They coexist with every human being. Therefore, Marlow's journey is not an expedition into a different world, but a gradual stripping away of the illusions through which humans see themselves as rational and moral. Another important hidden meaning is the critique of imperialism, but not a direct one, rather a metaphysical. Yeah, Conrad is not merely accusing individuals, nations, or policies. He is exposing the very mechanism by which violence is justified. Colonialism in the novel is always disguised with words like progress, trade, and civilization. Yet underneath them constantly emerges raw exploitation, and gradually it becomes clear the language of high purpose is just a thin shell hiding economic and psychological hunger for power. Interestingly, the darkness in the novel does not have a single source. It does not belong to Africa or to Kurtz. It doesn't even belong exclusively to Europe. It is distributed everywhere as if it exists within the system itself. This turns the novel from a story about colonialism in a narrow sense into a reflection on human nature in general. How easily any society can justify cruelty once it is labeled as necessary. In the end, the philosophy of the novel comes down to a disturbing idea. A person does not become evil, they simply stop restraining what was always inside them. And that is why the heart of darkness is not located on any map of the world, but it's the point where external rules end and the inner freedom begins. A freedom most people are not prepared for. If you enjoyed this video, support us with a like, comment, subscribe this channel and share with your friends. See you next time!